It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, a break from the monotony of life. Just a group of us, 5 friends, heading out to the woods to camp, drink, and forget about the world for a while. We'd chosen a spot not far from where you lived, a place you'd warned us about. That area's got a history, you'd said, your voice low and serious. Spirits, strange noises, things you can't explain. Be careful. We'd laughed it off, of course. Spirits? Strange noises? Please. We were young, invincible, and armed with enough beer to drown out any superstitions. But now, as I sit here trembling, clutching this flashlight like it's the only thing keeping me alive, I can't help but think you were right. Something is out there. And it's not just raccoons. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The forest was dense, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels. There was an eerie stillness to the air, a quiet that felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath. We set up our tents, started a fire, and cracked open the first of many beers. The laughter and chatter flowed freely, and for a while it felt like any other camping trip. But as the night deepened, so did the unease. The firelight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The woods, once silent, began to come alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant snaps of twigs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. At first, we brushed it off. Just animals, someone said. But the sounds grew louder, closer, more deliberate. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, waiting. By midnight, we were all thoroughly drunk, the fear drowned out by alcohol and bravado. We didn't bother securing the campsite. Why would we? We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from anyone or anything. What could possibly go wrong? One by one, we stumbled into our tents, leaving the cooler open, beer cans scattered around the fire pit, and food wrappers strewn about. The last thing I remember before passing out was the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I woke up to chaos. It was still dark, the kind of darkness that feels suffocating, like the world has been swallowed whole. My head pounded, my mouth was dry, and my body felt heavy with sleep. At first, I thought the noises were part of a dream. Hissing, growling, huffing, and the occasional high-pitched scream that made my blood run cold. But as I lay there, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, I realized the sounds were real, and they were coming from right outside my tent. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out into the night. What I saw made my stomach churn. The campsite was in shambles. The cooler was tipped over, its contents spilled across the ground. Beer cans were scattered everywhere, some crushed, others half buried in the dirt. The fire pit was a mess of ash and charred wood, and our food supplies were torn apart, wrappers and containers strewn about like confetti. But it wasn't the mess that terrified me, it was the creatures responsible for it. At first glance, they looked like raccoons. Small, furry bodies, masked faces, nimble paws, but there was something wrong about them. Their eyes glowed in the flashlight's beam, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. And the sounds they made, hisses, growls, guttural screams, were unlike anything I'd ever heard from an animal. I froze, breath caught in my throat as one of the creatures turned to look at me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt as if it could see into my soul. Then it let out a blood-curdling scream, and the others joined in, their voices rising in a cacophony of terror. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground, and scrambled back into the tent, zipping it shut as quickly as I could. The screams continued, growing louder, more frenzied. I could hear them moving around the campsite, their claws scraping against the ground, their bodies thudding against the tents. My friends were awake now, their voices panicked as they called out to each other. "What the hell is that?" someone shouted. "Stay in your tents!" another yelled. But it was too late. One of the creatures, or whatever they were, lunged at my tent, its claws tearing through the fabric. I screamed, scrambling backward as its snarling face appeared in the gap. Its teeth were bared, saliva dripping from its jaws. And its eyes, God, its eyes were filled with a malice that no animal should possess. I kicked at it, my foot connecting with its body. It let out a shrill cry before retreating. The chaos lasted for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the screams and growls faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I stayed in my tent, trembling, too afraid to move. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the trees, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The campsite was destroyed. The cooler was empty. The beer cans were gone. Our food supplies were completely obliterated. The tents were torn. The fire pit was a smoldering ruin. The ground was littered with claw marks and strange, unidentifiable tracks. My friends emerged from their tents, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. "What the hell happened last night?" one of them asked, voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We packed up what was left of our supplies in silence, the weight of the night's events hanging over us like a dark cloud. The 20-mile drive back to civilization felt like an eternity, each mile stretching out before us as we tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. We never went back to that campsite. In fact, none of us ever went camping again. But the memory of that night has stayed with me, haunting my dreams, filling me with a dread I can't shake. Those creatures, whatever they were, weren't just animals. They were something else, something darker, something that shouldn't exist.